Let me start with something simple, something official, something printed in textbooks and repeated so often nobody even thinks to question it anymore. In 1885, the home insurance building rose above Chicago at 10 stories tall, a steel-frame giant in a city still clawing its way into the modern age. We call it the first skyscraper. We give it a neat origin story. We attach a name to it, William LeBaron Jenney. We frame it as the triumphant beginning of a new era, the moment mankind learned to build upward. Clean, complete, settled. But before we go any further, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me. Because if you're drawn to hidden history, erased knowledge, impossible architecture, and the feeling that something crucial has been left out of the official story, this one gets stranger the deeper you look. Because the question that should come next is almost never asked. How did they actually do it? Not in the abstract, not in the romantic language of progress, not in the polished version where genius inventors appear on cue and history glides forward in a straight line. I mean, literally how. How did they quarry the stone, shape the iron, transport the materials, coordinate the crews, hoist the loads, align the facades, and lock everything into place with the kind of precision that still commands respect today? How did they do that at a scale so immense it still feels unnatural to look at? How did they do it with horses, pulleys, hand tools, inconsistent electricity, slow communication, and supply chains that, by modern standards, should have been chaotic, fragile, and constantly breaking down? That is not a poetic question. It is a practical one. And the more honestly you ask it, the less comfortable the official answer begins to feel. Because what we are told is that this was simply progress, industry maturing, engineering improving, men learning as they went. But real technological progress usually leaves fingerprints everywhere. It leaves failed experiments. It leaves half-working prototypes. It leaves disasters, revisions, public embarrassments, ugly intermediate stages, and structures that reveal the awkward learning curve of a civilization still figuring things out. You can see that pattern in aviation. You can see it in engines. You can see it in photography, computing, and transportation. First come the crude attempts, then the partial successes, then the embarrassing dead ends. Then finally, after years or decades of trial and error, something refined begins to emerge. But with these buildings, the middle seems strangely thin. That is where the unease begins. Look at the photographic record. There is no shortage of beauty. We have finished buildings in abundance, facades, grand staircases, domes, spires, ironwork so detailed it looks almost biological, stone carvings so precise they seem impossible for the conditions they were supposedly made under. We have dedication ceremonies, newspaper praise, portraits of architects, public statements, proud descriptions of triumph and ambition. What we do not seem to have in the quantity you would expect is the messy, exhaustive, ground-level record of how these things were actually brought into existence. And that absence matters, because if you are constructing buildings of enormous height, enormous weight, and enormous decorative complexity in the late 19th century, you would expect that process to leave a massive trail. You would expect foundation documentation. You would expect more detailed staging records. You would expect a richer archive of subcontractors, carving shops, metalworkers, rigging methods, training pipelines, construction failures, and technical improvisations. You would expect the struggle to be visible. Instead, all too often, the historical record feels like it begins in the middle and ends at the ribbon cutting. And once you notice that, it starts happening everywhere. Chicago, New York, Melbourne, Buenos Aires, São Paulo, Cairo, Bombay, Shanghai, different continents, different climates, different labor pools, different levels of industrial development, different political conditions, and yet, within a surprisingly narrow historical window, city after city begins producing monumental buildings with the same strange confidence. Not just large buildings, not just useful buildings, but highly ornamented, symbolically loaded, technically ambitious buildings that look less like a civilization experimenting and more like a civilization carrying out a tradition it already understands very well. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because if a society is genuinely inventing new methods under pressure, at the frontier of its capabilities, you would expect restraint. Function first. Stability first. Simplicity first. Solve the engineering problem, then decorate later. Solve the structural challenge, then add beauty once the system is proven. But that is not what we see. What we see right from the beginning is excess, precision, ornament everywhere, cornices loaded with detail, columns polished and proportioned with almost ceremonial care, terracotta, panels filled with foliage, faces, mythic imagery, repeating symbolic motifs, gargoyles, reliefs, iron latticework of astonishing intricacy, and not as an afterthought, not as decoration slapped on once the important work was done. These elements are integrated, planned, embedded into the whole design from the start. That does not feel like the behavior of people improvising. It feels like the behavior of people inheriting. And that is where the story stops being merely impressive and starts becoming unsettling. Take the Flatiron Building in New York, completed in 1902. People stand beneath it today and admire it as an icon. But pause and really look at it. That razor-thin wedge, that steel frame wrapped in limestone and terracotta, that confidence, that balance between mass and delicacy. It does not feel tentative. It does not feel experimental. It does not feel like a first draft. It feels like the work of people who already knew exactly what they were doing. Now, move to Melbourne in 1888, a city that, in historical terms, had barely existed long enough to establish itself. And yet, there rises the Rialto Building, clothed in Gothic Revival ornament with the kind of visual language you would expect from a much older cultural memory. Not merely imported style, but executed craft. Not just drawings from Europe, but physical mastery in stone and form. Now, jump again. South America, Asia, the colonial world, port cities, new capitals, expanding commercial hubs. And again, the same pattern emerges. Not isolated examples, not a one-off miracle here or there, a recurring phenomenon. Monumental architecture appearing with unnerving confidence almost everywhere at once. That is a coordination problem, and the deeper you sit with it, the more impossible it becomes to shrug off. Because architecture is not just design, it is logistics, it is labor, it is sequencing, it is timing, it is access to materials, it is the ability to train and manage highly specialized people who know exactly what to do and exactly when to do it. An architect can draw a magnificent building. That does not mean anyone exists who can actually build it. And this is where the labor question becomes dangerous to the official story. Take Biltmore in North Carolina. Construction begins in 1889. The scale alone is staggering. The decorative complexity is absurd. The materials came from multiple regions. Rail lines had to be extended. Quarries had to supply stone in staggering amounts. Artisans had to shape piece after piece after piece with consistency, with speed, with almost machine-like reliability. But without the machines we would associate with that level of output today. We are told roughly 1,000 men worked on it at peak. Fine, sit with that number. 1,000 men sounds like a lot until you imagine what the building actually required. Not just laborers, not just movers and haulers, skilled stone carvers, iron workers, finishers, joiners, masons capable of precision. Men who understood load, line, joinery, proportion, weathering, and ornamental execution. You cannot summon that workforce out of thin air. Craft at that level does not appear on command because a wealthy patron writes a check. It comes from training, from lineages, from workshops, from traditions carried across years, often generations. So, where were those traditions? Where were the schools? Where were the guilds? Where were the apprenticeship chains robust enough to produce armies of craftsmen able to execute work of that quality across the globe? Where are the archives that should accompany something so extensive and so organized? Yes, fragments exist. Yes, names appear. Yes, there are ledgers and contracts and occasional mentions. But that is not the same thing as a fully visible lineage of knowledge. Too often, the specialists responsible for the most astonishing work seem to flicker in and out of history like ghosts. Their names are listed, their firms appear briefly, then the trail thins out. Workshops are vaguely referenced, biographies vanish, training networks remain obscure, the hands that made the impossible are somehow the least documented part of the story. And maybe that would not matter if it happened in one city, but it happens everywhere. That is what makes it feel less like an accident and more like a pattern. Now this is where the word tartaria enters the room, and the moment it does, most people split in two directions. One side dismisses it instantly as fantasy. The other turns it into an all-purpose explanation for every unexplained building on Earth. Both reactions are too easy. So, let's slow down. There really were old maps using the term Tartary or Tartaria across huge regions of Eurasia. That much is not controversial. The controversy begins when people try to define what that label actually meant. Was it a unified empire? A loose geographic term used by outsiders? A placeholder for territories poorly understood by mapmakers? A cultural zone? A civilizational remnant? A cartographic convenience masking something far more complex? That is where things become foggy. But maybe that fog is exactly the point. Because the most interesting possibility is not the simplistic version, where a hidden empire built every grand structure and then vanished overnight. The more interesting possibility is harder to package and harder to dismiss. What if the term points, however imperfectly, toward a vast reservoir of craft traditions, engineering habits, material knowledge, and building practices that were never fully integrated into the official story of modernity? What if the 19th century was not purely the birth of something new, but also the last flowering of something old? What if what looks like sudden emergence was actually inheritance in disguise? Once you ask that, a lot of things begin to shift, because then the ornament stops looking decorative and starts looking evidentiary. Then the confidence of the buildings stops looking miraculous and starts looking residual. Then the missing archives stop looking random and start looking like the aftermath of knowledge that moved differently, survived differently, and died differently than bureaucratic institutions prefer. What if some of that knowledge was not transmitted primarily through paper? What if it moved through embodied craft, through hands, through repetition, through worksite memory, through master-to-apprentice relationships that left behind buildings but not manuals, through communities displaced by war, migration, economic upheaval, imperial expansion, or cultural absorption? What would the archive look like after that kind of transmission chain was broken? It would look incomplete. It would look fragmented. It would look exactly like what we have. And this is where the official explanation starts feeling less false than insufficient. That difference matters. The problem is not that mainstream history explains nothing. The problem is that it often explains just enough to close the case before the real questions can be asked. It tells you the style. It names the architect. It gives you the patron, the year, the cost, the dedication speech, maybe a few heroic anecdotes about innovation. But it does not fully account for the sheer density of coordination, skill, and inherited certainty embedded in the buildings themselves. And the buildings are still there. That is what makes this impossible to ignore. You can argue with theories. You can mock speculation. You can dismiss inconvenient questions as romanticism or internet mythology. But the buildings remain. Stone, iron, terracotta, granite, vaulted halls, carved capitals, facades that still dwarf modern attempts at equivalent beauty. They are not rumors. They are not legends. They are physical evidence, standing in plain sight, so familiar most people no longer see how strange they really are. And then comes the next mystery. Why does it stop? Because by the early 20th century, something changes. The old ornament begins to recede. The rich surfaces flatten. The carved detail thins out. The grotesques disappear. The moldings vanish. The vocabulary of architecture becomes cleaner, harsher, more stripped, more industrial in appearance. We are told this happened because modernism was more rational, more honest, more efficient. And maybe part of that is true. But is that the whole story? Or did something else happen at the same time? Did a reservoir of skill begin drying up? Did the craftspeople capable of executing those older programs age out and die without replacement? Did industrialization standardize building in a way that made inherited ornament economically inconvenient? Did wars, migrations, educational reforms, and the collapse of older training networks sever the root of a much older tradition? Did the world simply lose the people who knew how to do certain things and then rename that loss as progress? That possibility should trouble more people than it does. Because if that is what happened, then the 19th century was not merely an age of innovation. It was also an age of forgetting. And forgetting is never clean. It leaves strange traces, scattered traditions, regional techniques, folkloric survivals, isolated communities preserving methods nobody else can fully explain. Little echoes along trade routes, mountain corridors, old cultural thresholds. The kind of remnants that do not prove a grand unified theory, but also do not fit comfortably inside the tidy narrative we have been handed. And that is the real tension here, not certainty, pattern. A pattern of capability appearing faster than it should. A pattern of craftsmanship with roots deeper than the records suggest. A pattern of global similarity without a satisfying account of the human networks that carried it. A pattern of documentation that is present enough to reassure, but thin enough to conceal. A pattern of flourishing followed by collapse. And once you see that pattern, it becomes very hard to go back to sleep inside the official version. Because now every old city feels different. Every 19th century core feels charged. You walk past facades you once ignored, and suddenly they no longer look normal. They look improbable. You start noticing the windows, the symmetry, the stone courses, the iron balconies, the reliefs over doorways, the impossible consistency of decorative programs that had no business being so refined if they were truly the products of a civilization just learning to build at that level. You start asking dangerous questions. Who trained these people? Who supplied this confidence? What was inherited and then renamed as invention? What disappeared so completely that all we have left are the works themselves? And why does so much of the record feel like description instead of explanation? Because there is a difference, a profound difference. You can describe a cathedral, a courthouse, a railway station, a hotel, a capitol building, a skyscraper. You can list its dimensions, you can name its architect, you can tell me when it opened and who paid for it and what style it belongs to. But that is not the same as explaining how a civilization came to possess the seamless ability to create it, replicate it, and then lose that ability within a few generations. That is the mystery. Not one building, not one city, not one map label, not one conspiracy slogan. A deeper mystery, a missing middle, a break in the chain. Maybe tartaria is the wrong word. Maybe it is only a placeholder, a name people reach for because they can sense the official story has blank spaces in it, and they are trying to point at the shape of the absence. Maybe the true answer is messier than empire and stranger than accident. Maybe it involves forgotten migrations, absorbed traditions, erased workshops, inherited techniques, and history so fragmented that by the time the modern world arrived, it could only mistake the final glow of older knowledge for a brand new dawn. Or maybe it is something stranger still. What matters is that the question remains alive, because these buildings do not feel like first attempts. They feel like late attempts, mature attempts, the work of people standing at the end of a long line, not the beginning of one. And if that feeling is even partially true, then the 19th century was not simply the age when we learned to build the modern world. It may also have been the age when the last custodians of an older world were still here, still working, still shaping stone and iron into forms whose full lineage we can no longer trace. That possibility changes everything. So the next time you pass one of these buildings, do not just admire it, study it. Stand still and really look. Look at the carved surfaces. Look at the structural audacity. Look at the integration of beauty and engineering. Look at the confidence embedded in every line. Then ask yourself a question so simple, it becomes explosive the moment you take it seriously. Does the story we have been given actually explain this? Or does it merely name it, file it, and move on? Because if it only names it, then the mystery is still open. And if the mystery is still open, then maybe the most important chapters of this story were never written the way we were taught to expect. Maybe the archive is not where we were told to look. Maybe the silence is part of the evidence. Maybe what survives in stone, iron, and ornament is not just architecture, but testimony. A stubborn, magnificent testimony that says human beings once knew how to do things we no longer fully understand, that they built with a confidence we struggle to account for, and that whatever carried that knowledge forward was interrupted, severed, or buried under a cleaner narrative. Maybe that should bother us. Maybe historians should be more troubled by it. Maybe architects should be. Maybe anyone who has ever stood beneath one of these structures and felt that faint, creeping disorientation should be. Because that feeling is trying to tell you something. It is the feeling of standing in front of evidence that does not sit comfortably inside the explanation attached to it. And once you feel that, really feel it, you cannot unfeel it. So now I want to hear from you. What do you think happened here? Was this simply industrial progress moving faster than our instincts are willing to accept? Was it the final flowering of older craft traditions the modern world barely remembered even as it used them? Was tartaria a distorted label for something real but badly misunderstood? Or are these buildings the leftovers of a knowledge system that was never properly recorded and then quietly disappeared? Comment with your theory. Tell me which detail refuses to leave your mind. And if you want more investigations into erased history, architectural anomalies, lost civilizations, and the mysteries still hiding in plain sight, subscribe and stay close. Because the buildings are still standing, the questions are still unanswered, and whatever truth they were built to carry, it may not be gone as completely as we've been told.